Do you believe that a single secret can change everything? Imagine being about to say yes on the happiest day of your life, only to discover that the person next to you is hiding a devastating betrayal. That's exactly what happened to Elisa when, at the altar, the unexpected happened. The priest interrupted the ceremony with a revelation that shocked everyone. But what did he see? And how did this transform Elisa's destiny forever? Stay with us, because this story is a roller coaster of emotions, twists and turns, and the courage to start over. Matteo adjusted the rear-view mirror of his Fiat Cinquecento as the road gently snaked before him. The late afternoon light painted the sky with shades of gold and purple, creating an almost unreal scene. He had a slight smile on his face, something typical when he was about to celebrate a special ceremony. Elisa, the bride at that night's wedding, was almost like a daughter to him. He had known the young woman since she was baptized, and now, seeing her about to get married, seemed like an important milestone in his journey as a priest. But even with the air of tranquility, there was something that bothered Matteo deeply. He couldn't identify the reason, but his heart was restless, as if a shadow hung over that day. He took a deep breath, trying to ignore the feeling, until he saw something on the side of the road. It was a bright red car, clearly expensive, parked somewhat sloppily. The model was unmistakable, a luxurious sports car that seemed out of place on the simplicity of that road. Matteo slowed down, recognizing the vehicle immediately. It belonged to Marco, the groom who, in a matter of hours, would say yes at the altar. Matteo parked his small car a few meters back and got out, adjusting his cassock carefully. He walked slowly towards the car, realizing that the tinted windows blocked any view of the interior. Something about the silence of the scene made him suspicious. He lightly tapped on the driver's window. After a few seconds, the window began to descend. Marco appeared with messy hair and a forced smile. Beside her, a woman with golden hair was desperately trying to put her appearance back together, adjusting her blouse and avoiding eye contact. "Father Matteo, what a surprise to see you here." Marco's voice was one of forced enthusiasm. Matteo narrowed his eyes. "Problems on the road, Marco?" "Oh, yes, you know how temperamental those Italian cars are." The engine stopped out of nowhere. He laughed nervously, but his eyes betrayed his nervousness. Matteo looked at the woman, who pretended to be distracted using her cell phone. "And are you also a fan of sports cars?" asked Matteo, with an eyebrow raised. The woman didn't respond, just glanced at Marco as if asking for instructions. Marco cleared his throat and quickly replied, "She is my cousin. He came to help me with the car." Matteo crossed his arms, keeping his expression serious. "Cousin, huh? What a supportive family. But I'm curious, since when do you have to keep the windows closed to discuss mechanics?" The silence that followed was deafening. Marco opened the car door and got out, trying to show confidence. He approached Matteo, lowering his voice. "Father, it's not what it seems." "I can explain." Matteo took a step back, as if Marco's very presence was uncomfortable. "It is not necessary. I've seen enough." Marco tried to grab the priest's arm, but Matteo pushed him away with a firm gesture. "Marco, are you really going to face Elisa at the altar with that lie in your heart?" Marco hesitated, but before he could respond, Matteo continued, "I am only the mediator, but the altar is sacred. If you lie in front of him, you will be lying not only to Elisa, but to God." Marco remained silent, his shoulders slumped, as Matteo walked away, returning to the Fiat Cinquecento. On the short ride to the cathedral, Matteo struggled with his thoughts. He knew that the decision to expose the truth could destroy Elisa's dream, but allowing a marriage based on lies to happen seemed even worse. "Lord, guide me," he whispered, as he gripped the steering wheel tightly. As he parked near the cathedral, Matteo noticed the first guests arriving. Every smile and greeting only added to the weight in his chest. He knew that what he was about to do would forever change everyone's lives, including his own. Climbing the steps of the cathedral, Matteo stopped for a moment, looking up at the now dark sky. "Elisa deserves the truth, even if it hurts," he said to himself before entering the cathedral. The cathedral was impeccably lit, with soft lights that highlighted the details of the colorful stained glass windows. Elisa, in her white dress, was the center of attention. Every step he took, even before walking down the aisle, seemed to float in perfect harmony with the music that filled the air. Her eyes shone, radiant, like a woman who was about to fulfill her lifelong dream. However, Marco, next to the altar, was restless. His smile seemed forced, and he constantly adjusted his tie, as if it were tightening more than it should. Matteo watched everything from a corner, trying to maintain his composure. His mind echoed the scene on the road and what he had witnessed. When Elisa finally stopped next to Marco, the priest leading the ceremony smiled, beginning to welcome those present. Matteo, however, felt that every word was like a needle in his conscience. He knew he couldn't stay silent for long. "Dear friends and family, we are here to witness the union of Marco and Elisa, a bond that—" The priest was interrupted by the sound of Matteo's footsteps advancing down the central corridor. The guests turned around, confused, as Matteo walked down the aisle with firm steps. His face was serious, but serene. Marco, seeing him approaching, swallowed hard, while Elisa, curious, slightly furrowed her eyebrows. "Sorry for the interruption," Matteo began, his voice firm but not aggressive. "But there is something that needs to be said before this union takes place." The tension in the room became palpable. Murmurs began to spread among the guests like an invisible wind filled with doubts. The priest presiding over the ceremony seemed surprised, but gestured for Matteo to continue. "Matteo, what's going on?" asked Elisa, confused, but with a touch of concern in her voice. Matteo looked at her, his eyes reflecting a mix of pity and determination. "Elisa, you are like a daughter to me, and that's why I need to be honest, even if it hurts you." Marco stepped forward, interrupting. "Father, that is not necessary. We can discuss this later." "After," Matteo replied with a tone that mixed irony and gravity. "Then it will be too late. The altar is a real place, Marco, and what I saw today cannot be ignored." Elisa looked at Marco, her hands starting to shake slightly. "What is he saying, Marco? What is he talking about?" Marco hesitated, his gaze dropping to the floor. Matteo took a deep breath before continuing. "I saw you, Marco, on the road, with another woman. You weren't discussing the car's engine." The room erupted in loud murmurs. Some guests placed their hands over their mouths in shock, while others exchanged incredulous looks. Elisa took a step back, as if the words had physical weight. "Is that true, Marco?" she asked, her voice breaking slightly. "Elisa, I can explain," he replied, raising his hands as if he could contain the storm that was brewing. "Explain, then," she replied, with tears beginning to form in her eyes. "Explain how you managed to cheat on me on our wedding day." Marco looked around for support, but found only judgmental faces. He turned to Matteo, his expression a mix of anger and despair. "You had no right to do that." "I had every right," Matteo replied without backing down. "The right to protect Elisa from a lie, the woman who was with Marco in the car, until then sitting discreetly among the guests, stood up abruptly. It's not like that. He was confused and I was just there to help him." The murmurs rose again. Elisa looked at the woman, then back at Marco. His pained expression became a mask of indignation. "Is this who you chose to betray me? One of the people I invited to witness our love?" Marco tried to get closer, but Elisa raised her hand like an insurmountable barrier. "No! Don't you dare touch me!" Matteo watched, standing firm. He knew he had made the right decision, but that didn't make the scene any less painful. Elisa's eyes met his for a brief moment, and there was a mix of gratitude and sadness in her gaze. "Father Matteo, thank you for protecting me," she said, with a trembling but resolute voice. Matteo nodded slightly, feeling the weight of that moment in every fibre of his being. Silence took over the cathedral for a moment, interrupted only by the echo of a muffled sob. Elisa remained standing at the altar, her trembling fingers holding the hem of her dress. Her gaze was fixed on Marco, but her happy bride expression was gone. Now she looked like a living statue, on the verge of falling apart. "So, is it true?" She finally broke the silence, her voice coming out almost like a whisper. Marco tried to take a step towards her, but Elisa quickly backed away, as if his touch was something unbearable. "Elisa, listen to me. It was a mistake. I was nervous about the wedding, and things got out of hand." She laughed, but the laugh was bitter, almost cruel. "Did they get out of control? How did you have the courage?" "On our wedding day, Marco." The guests remained in shock, some whispering discreetly while others kept their eyes fixed on the couple. The priest presiding over the ceremony was still motionless, clearly not knowing how to proceed. Matteo, on the other hand, didn't look away, ready to act if Elisa needed support. "It was just a moment of weakness, Elisa. It doesn't mean anything." Marco seemed desperate, but his words were cold, as if he was trying to minimize the seriousness of his betrayal. "Nothing?" Elisa's eyes shone with angry tears. "So explain to me why nothing was on the road with you while I was preparing for the most important day of my life." The woman who had been with Marco tried to intervene, but Matteo raised a firm hand, silencing her before she could say anything. He knew her words would only make the situation worse. Elisa, however, turned directly to her. "You were invited to attend my wedding. You were supposed to be supporting me, not destroying my life behind my back." The woman hesitated, a blush rising to her face as she looked away. Marco tried once again to get closer. "Elisa, please forgive me. I love you." She backed away again, her voice cracking but firm. "Love? Don't talk to me about love, Marco. What you feel for me is not love. Love is respect. It is loyalty. It's everything you proved you didn't have." Matteo finally stepped forward, standing next to Elisa like a pillar of support. He looked at Marco seriously, but without rancor. "Marco, you had choices. Choices that could have shown the man he really is. But instead he chose lies and selfishness." Marco was silent, clearly without arguments. Elisa took a deep breath, drying her tears with the back of her hand. She looked around at the guests, at Matteo, and finally at Marco. "This marriage is over," she declared firmly. The murmurs among the guests intensified. Some seemed relieved, others shocked, but everyone understood that Elisa was no longer willing to be humiliated. She removed the veil with a quick gesture and placed it on the altar. Marco tried to get closer again, but Matteo put his hand on his shoulder, stopping him from moving forward. "I think you've done enough, Marco," said Matteo in a calm but firm tone. Elisa walked down the central aisle with firm steps, while the guests moved aside to make way. Her dress trailed the floor, and despite the tears that still flowed, her posture was one of dignity and strength. When she reached the exit of the cathedral, one of the bridesmaids tried to catch up with her. "Elisa, wait! Where are you going?" She stopped for a moment, looking back with a sad smile. "I don't know, but I know I won't stay here." As she left the cathedral, Elisa felt the fresh wind hit her face, as if freedom had finally found space to enter her life. Matteo followed soon after, finding her sitting on the steps, looking at the horizon. "You were very brave in there," he said, sitting down next to her. "I don't feel brave," she replied, her voice low. "I feel broken. Sometimes being brave just means continuing when everything seems to be falling apart." Matteo replied with a slight smile. She turned her face to him, surprised by the words. For the first time that night, he felt a spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the start of something new. The soft sound of the wind accompanied the silence as Elisa walked through the small square in front of the cathedral. Night had already fallen, and the streetlights cast long shadows on the stone floor. Every step she took felt lighter, although the weight of emotion still hung over her. The pain was there, but along with it, a feeling of relief was beginning to form, shy but real. Matteo watched from a distance, not wanting to invade her moment. He knew Elisa needed space to process everything. Still, her presence was a subtle reminder that she wasn't alone. Elisa stopped next to a small fountain in the center of the square. The running water seemed to mesmerize her as her fingers played with the edges of the veil she still held. Finally, she let out a long sigh and let the veil fall into the water, watching it float before being carried away by the current. "A symbolic gesture?" asked Matteo, approaching with a soft smile. Elisa turned to him, her eyes still red, but now with a gleam of determination. "Perhaps. Or maybe I just needed to get rid of one more weight." He smiled, nodding. "Sometimes starting over requires leaving some things behind." Elisa shook her head, agreeing. But there was a restlessness in his face, something Matteo noticed immediately. "Are you worried about what people will say?" She hesitated for a moment before responding. "No, I don't think so. I mean, of course there will always be people who judge, but I couldn't continue. Not with that. You did what you needed to do, Elisa. She was brave enough to choose the truth, even when it hurt. This is something that few can do." She smiled, a small but genuine smile. He sat on the bench next to the fountain and looked up at the starry sky. "And now, Father Matteo, what do I do with this new life?" "I would say, take it one step at a time," he replied, sitting down next to her. "Maybe start with something you always wanted to do, but never had the courage." Elisa tilted her head, considering the words. "I always dreamed of traveling. Not to escape, but to rediscover myself. I think I need this now." Matteo nodded again. "Then start there. Sometimes a change of scenery helps us discover parts of ourselves that were hidden." She laughed lightly. "And you, Father? Will you be okay after today?" Matteo looked at her with a warm smile. "Don't worry about me. I just fulfilled my role. You are the one who has a new journey ahead of you." Elisa raised her eyes to the sky again, taking a deep breath. For the first time that night, he felt a spark of freedom. She didn't know exactly where she would go, but she knew the path forward was hers to walk. Days later, Elisa boarded a train that would take her to another city, far from Verona. The station was busy, but she felt strangely calm. He was carrying a light suitcase, but his heart no longer felt so heavy. As the train pulled away, she looked out the window and saw the landscapes changing quickly. He felt a mixture of sadness and excitement. The life he left behind still hurt, but the future, for the first time, looked promising. In the new city, Elisa walked along unfamiliar streets, enjoying the feeling of anonymity. He found a cozy cafe and sat at a table next to the window, watching the people on the street. It was there, in that simple moment, that he felt a peace that he hadn't experienced in a long time. When the waiter brought your order, he placed a small note next to your coffee cup. Confused, she opened it and read, "Welcome to the fresh start. Every day is a new chance. Elisa looked around, but didn't see anyone she knew. He smiled, thinking maybe it was just a coincidence. But the note was a reminder that new beginnings are full of mystery and possibilities. And so her new journey began, with hope in her heart and the certainty that the truth will always guide her to something better.